What happens when the church's two biggest saints had totally different visions for the future? Peter and Paul share a feast day, but not much else. It's a study in leadership, legacy, and the power struggles that shaped faith. So let's talk about how two radically different leaders shaped Christianity's future and what it means for us today. Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is my favorite part of these weekly presentations because it gives me a chance to dig deeper into something that came up during the main episode. So here's a question that doesn't get asked often enough. Why do Peter and Paul, two men who clearly didn't always get along, why do they share a feast day in the Catholic calendar? I mean, imagine being commemorated every year with the coworker who once called you a hypocrite in front of the entire team. A bit awkward, right? Now, don't get me wrong. Peter and Paul are both considered giants of the early Christian movement. But their leadership styles, their backgrounds, and even their theologies were wildly different. One was a fisherman who stumbled his way into leadership and never really stopped stumbling. The other was a highly educated Roman citizen who basically barged into the story after Jesus had already left the building, then proceeded to write about half the New Testament. So, in this episode of Afterthoughts, we're digging into those differences. And more importantly, we're going to explore how those differences shaped the future of Christianity in ways most people have never thought about. Because, let's be honest, the version of Christianity we ended up with owes a lot more to Paul than to Peter. And that raises an interesting question. What might have happened if Paul never joined the movement? What if Christianity had remained a small Jewish sect led by folks like Peter and James, instead of becoming a global empire with Paul's theology at the helm? Now, before we get into that, let me just say this. For the sake of this discussion, I'm going to assume some of the traditionally accepted church positions are true, like that Peter was a real person, that Jesus handpicked him, and that Paul had a genuine experience that flipped his worldview. Yes, there's debate about all of that in academic circles, and maybe we'll talk about that in a future episode. But today, we're setting those debates aside to focus on the dynamics between these two figures. They're very human differences, and the huge impact those differences seem to have had on the shape of the Christian faith. So, top off your drink, settle in, and let's step into the first century drama that helped create a religion, because this episode of Afterthoughts is all about Peter, Paul, and the fight for Christianity's future. Okay, so let's officially meet our two main characters, Peter and Paul. Not to be confused with the folk singers. These two weren't writing protest songs or singing about puffing magic dragons, although based on some of Paul's letters, you might wonder what kind of incense he was burning. So let's start with Peter, or Simon as he was originally named, until Jesus renamed him Peter, which literally means rock. And yes, I know that that's technically Petros in Greek, but we're not going full seminary mode here. Peter was a working-class Galilean fisherman, likely illiterate, and he probably smelled a lot like fish. He was rough around the edges, he was impulsive, constantly getting things wrong, but he had heart. And according to the story, Jesus saw something in him, not polish, not pedigree. Jesus saw potential. As the story goes, Peter was chosen personally. Right? He got to walk with Jesus, eat with him, watch the miracles, and even briefly walk on water. Though, to be fair, that didn't end super well for Peter. Now let's talk about Paul. Paul's the guy who enters the chat room about 30 seconds after Jesus exits. He never met Jesus during his lifetime, but that didn't stop him from becoming the movement's most prolific writer and self-appointed authority. And that's critical. Paul was everything Peter wasn't. Paul was educated. He was urban. He was a Roman citizen, fluent in philosophy and law. He trained as a Pharisee, which means he was part of the religious elite. And yet, he became the champion of a movement that was originally grassroots and largely Jewish. His claim to fame? A mystical experience on the road to Damascus. He says he saw a vision of the risen Jesus, and it totally changed his life. So already we've got a pretty fascinating dynamic here. Peter's your blue collar, salt of the earth kind of guy. He's tradition. He's loyalty. He's the rock. Paul is innovation. He's the pivot guy. He's the one who says, "Hey, let's bring in the Gentiles. Let's take this party global." One was a man of the sea. The other was a man of the city. Symbolically, Peter represents the foundation, the anchor to the past. Paul represents the expansion, the rebranding, if you will. So one clung to the original mission, the other rewrote the playbook. And as we'll see in a moment, those roles weren't always compatible. In fact, they collided more than once. But first, let's take a closer look at what these two actually believed and how their visions for this new Jesus movement started to diverge. Now, let's talk about the drama. Because yes, even the early church had its own reality TV moments. And one of the biggest came in Antioch, when Paul basically called Peter a hypocrite to his face. And picture it. Peter's been hanging out with the Gentile converts, sharing meals, living his best inclusive life, until some Jews from James show up. And suddenly, Peter backs off. He stops eating with the Gentiles. He starts acting like he's too cool for their kosher, unapproved casseroles. Paul sees this and just loses it. He flips out. In Galatians 2, he writes that he confronted Peter to his face because he stood condemned. Ooh, yikes. Grab your popcorn. This is going to be good. But behind this little lunchroom spat was a much bigger issue. We're Gentiles, right? The non-Jews. Were the Gentiles really welcome in this Jesus movement? And if so, did they have to follow Jewish law? Right? That meant things like circumcision, avoiding pork, keeping a kosher diet, observing all the customs and rituals. Well, Paul said no, absolutely not. He believed that faith in Jesus Christ was enough. Now, Peter, depending on the day and who was watching, seemed a little more inconsistent. And it just depends upon who you ask. This conflict came to a head at what we now call the Council of Jerusalem. Think of it like the first church synod, or maybe an ancient version of a very tense team meeting. And the result was a sort of compromise. Gentile converts didn't have to go all the way with Jewish law, but they were encouraged to avoid certain things, like meat sacrificed to idols or drinking blood, which honestly should already be on everyone's no thanks list. Now, here's what's wild. This moment, this disagreement about whether the Jesus movement should stay within Judaism or open up to the Gentile world, this moment ended up being absolutely pivotal. It shaped the entire future of Christianity. And yet, how often do you hear it mentioned in church? You ever sat through a homily on Paul roasting Peter for being two-faced? Yeah, I haven't. Priests usually gloss over this stuff. Maybe because it doesn't fit the neat narrative of a unified early church led by saintly men holding hands and singing Kumbaya. They'd rather focus on the sanitized version, right? Peter the rock, Paul the great missionary, and everyone just kind of got along fine. But the truth is, these were human beings trying to navigate a complicated cultural and, for them, spiritual transition. And they did not always agree. And frankly, it's those very disagreements that make the story more relatable and way more honest. So let's bust another myth while we're here. Christianity did not begin as one big happy family with matching robes and synchronized doctrine. In the beginning, it was more like a patchwork quilt, sort of stitched together by different communities, different interpretations, and very different priorities. You had the Jerusalem church, led by James, who was Jesus' brother, which stayed closely tied to Jewish law and practice. Then there were the Ebionites, who thought Jesus was fully human, not divine at all. And that followers still needed to follow Jewish customs. Meanwhile, Pauline churches, right, the churches that followed Paul's theology, were spreading across the Roman Empire, right, especially among the Gentiles. They're preaching freedom from the law and a more mystical connection to Christ. And let's not forget the Gnostics, who said, forget your body. What really matters is secret knowledge and spiritual awakening. Now, these folks had an entirely different vibe, and I mean entirely. We're talking cosmic duels, hidden truths, and enough esoteric symbolism to just make your head spin. The point is, early Christianity wasn't a single thing. It was an entire spectrum, a messy, dynamic, often contradictory collection of groups who all thought they were following Jesus the right way. Kind of like how today's Christians can't even agree on whether to serve grape juice or wine. Only back then, the stakes were a lot higher, and disagreements could lead to excommunication or far worse. Over time, though, Paul's version of Christianity rose to the top. The theology that emphasized Jesus' death and resurrection, that emphasized salvation through faith, and, frankly, the rejection of Jewish law, well, that became the dominant narrative. Not necessarily because it was truer, but because it was more portable. It was more adaptable. It was easier to spread that message to non-Jews and align with Roman political structures. But make no mistake, this came at a cost. Right? The beautiful diversity, the theological experimentation, the cultural overlap, it all got smoothed out. It got edited and eventually stamped heretical by the rising orthodoxy. So the next time someone says the early church was unified in belief, feel free to smile politely and say, actually, it was a lot more like a theological Wild West until Paul's posse took control. All right, so now that we've talked theology and turf wars, let's get into the personalities behind the pulpits. Peter and Paul. Because, wow, what a contrast. As I said, on the one hand, you've got Peter, the Galilean fisherman, a little rough around the edges, probably smelled like boat all the time. Bless him. He's the guy who really wanted to do the right thing, even if he stumbled a lot. His leadership was defined more by emotion than by eloquence. He was humble, sometimes very hesitant and just famously loyal, until he wasn't. Remember, he denied even knowing Jesus 3 times in a single night. Ouch. But what makes Peter relatable is that he's the kind of person who fails forward. He screws up, he owns it, and he keeps trying. He is definitely more of a shepherd than a general. Pastoral, not strategic. The guy who brings you soup when you're sick, not a PowerPoint presentation on salvation metrics. And then there's Paul. You know, Paul walked into every meeting like he owned the place, even if he just converted last week. Paul was bold, educated, just very prolific in his writing, right? Writing letter after letter like he was trying to meet some divine word count. He never met Jesus in person, but that didn't stop him from acting like he understood Jesus far better than the disciples who allegedly lived right alongside Jesus. Paul had the conviction of a man who never doubts that he's right. And he had the arrogance of someone who's been told he's a genius way too often. But hey, he got shit done. He built communities. He laid the groundwork for centuries of Christian theology. He made the brand global, if you will. That was Paul's doing. So here's the question I think we need to ask ourselves. Which kind of leader do we actually need more of? The humble shepherd who admits when he's wrong? Or the strategic visionary who sometimes forgets there are other people in the room? And maybe more importantly, which kind do we tend to trust with power? And why? Because if we're being completely honest, charisma often wins out over character, right? Confidence beats compassion. Slick speeches overshadow someone who's just showing up to do service for others. But the Peter types, right, they're out there, quietly making sure things work, lifting others up and leading with heart. We just don't always give those guys and gals the mic. Okay, let's have a little fun. What if Paul had just stayed in his lane, never had the mystical vision, never launched his missionary startup across the Gentile world, just stayed in his Pharisee lane? What would a Peter-only Christianity have looked like? Well, for starters, we probably wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. Without Paul's charisma, his ambition, and his aggressive networking skills, this whole Christian thing may have remained a small Jewish reform movement. Just one more sect trying to navigate Roman occupation and its own religious traditions. No big imperial conversions, no Constantine, no Vatican, certainly no mega churches with fog machines and light shows. Sorry, Hillsong. But here's the thing. That version of Christianity might have been smaller and healthier. More communal, less hierarchical, and more focused on compassion and shared meals rather than on doctrine and empire building. A movement built around Peter's brand of humble, stumbling leadership might have stayed closer to the margins, and maybe that's where it would have done the most good. Fewer gold-plated cathedrals, that's for sure, but probably a hell of a lot more bread shared on the beach. Of course, we'll never know, but I think it's worth asking. Could a quieter, humbler, less imperial version of this Christian movement have not only survived, but actually thrived in a way that didn't require conquering anyone? It's a big what if, sure. But sometimes those questions tell us more about what we value than any history book ever could. All right, so why does any of this matter today? Peter and Paul, their clashes, their leadership styles, their legacy tug of war. I mean, they lived almost 2,000 years ago, so why should we care? Well, because those same tensions, they're still with us. Think about it. Inclusion versus gatekeeping. Humility versus ego. Diversity versus dogma. They play out in our churches, our politics, even our office meetings, anywhere power and purpose collide. And in religious institutions especially, we've seen just how devastating that imbalance can end up being. The sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church didn't spiral out of control because too many leaders were like Peter, awkward and uncertain. It spiraled because they weren't like Peter at all. They refused to admit mistakes. They didn't show any humility whatsoever. They doubled down, protected the hierarchy, and covered it all up to maintain their image. That's not pastoral. That's authoritarian. And while we're at it, let's not pretend tradition doesn't have its downsides. Peter's emphasis on staying rooted in tradition might help explain why so many Christian churches still refuse to ordain women or give them any real authority. Meanwhile, Paul, bless his intense, slightly exhausting heart, might have at least theoretically been open to change. Sure, he was still a product of his time, but his whole ministry was about reaching people outside the acceptable boundaries. That kind of forward motion, when it's rooted in values, not ego, that can be a powerful thing. So here's the takeaway. Our future depends on the kind of leaders we elevate and the kind of followers we choose to be. Leadership isn't just about charisma or credentials. It's about character. And followership isn't passive. Followership is powerful too. Because the line between Peter and Paul, that line lives on. And if Christianity, or any community really, is going to thrive, it has to find a better balance between holding on to the past and moving forward into the future. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to thecodaproject.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll also keep you updated on the weekly live streams of Mythologizing the Bible. Also, if you subscribe for free over at thecodaproject.com, you'll start receiving my weekly resource called The Weekly Compass. This is a brief, once-a-week guide on a single core value. Think of it as a mini lesson plan for personal growth. It's perfect for families, students, and adults because I include discussion questions designed for each age group. Each weekly issue centers on a short reflection about the week's value, followed by discussion questions that are tailored for different age groups, from kids to college students to adults, and then a simple take action step, like a small challenge or exercise you can do to put that value into practice. Especially for families, it's designed to be an easy way to ensure that at least once a week, you're making time to talk about morality, ethics, and core values. So if you're interested, go subscribe for free at thecodaproject.com. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth.